You know, I am working on gaming videos, mainly one for Veilguard and some sex games I wanted to talk about, and every so often I wake in a cold sweat recalling that I have a whole second half of my Death Stranding analysis to somehow claw and stitch together from my desiccated memory. But I wanted to clarify something from my last undoubtedly depressing as fuck video, because I realized to some what I said might sound like a dog whistle or a call to action to some more unsavory types on the internet. So, just to put it frankly, fuck incels, fuck the misogynists who mobilize them, and fuck the racists and anti-Semites they regularly ally themselves with. No one is owed a partner, either for sex or romance, and blaming a specific group of people for it just makes you a shitty person. When I talked about day-to-day ostracism, I'm talking to a prevailing sense of isolation in the world that seems to say at every turn, you do not matter, you are not special, and no one should inherently care about you. I empathize with those people who are good, caring people who feel that they are not afforded basic human decency or the chance to prove themselves worthy of acknowledgement or affection because they're the unlucky sort, as I've been much of my life, who gets ghosted, rejected, and unchosen in many situations. Though to be totally honest, there's a lot of times in my earlier life that I deserved it. It doesn't mean that these people are entitled to anything and definitely does not justify bigotry, but I empathize with the sense of worthlessness and self-loathing that can come as a result. People like to say nobody owes you anything, and I despise that phrase. A lot of people like to think that they made it to where they are in life because of their own hard work and the work of their parents, but I'm sorry to say, unless you grew up in a wasteland or some woods in the middle of nowhere with literally your only form of human contact being your parents, then that simply isn't true. I mean, even then, you at least have to thank your parents' parents and their parents for existing at all. By the way, if it sounds like I'm good, I'm not. I just spent like all of yesterday crying, but I had the idea for this video sometime today, and I, after work, just started writing the script for it, and I kept being reminded of a video I watched about a year ago by the YouTuber and author and feminist scholar Alice Capel, The Instrumentalization of Emotional Labor. She talks about ghosting, she talks about putting on a mask, and she talks about this idea that you don't owe anyone anything. And so I'm going to be using a lot of her video to emphasize the points that I'm making in this video.
Neoliberalism basically tells you you don't owe anyone anything. Hustle bros understand that as focus all your energy on building your brand. But there is another way to understand it, one that goes like this. Quote, I need to focus my energy on protecting my peace and well-being, which means no emotional labor from me, sorry. The interpretation is different, but the philosophy is the same. I don't owe anything to anyone. Now, if we take the second interpretation, the one based on avoiding emotional labor to preserve your peace, you have to agree that protecting your peace goes hand in hand with the idea of understanding who you truly are, you know? You are on your own journey trying to find your authentic self or your brand. That quest becomes ever more urgent as everything around us draws us towards inauthenticity, insincerity. The only solution we see presented to us and encouraged by modern therapy is to turn in on ourselves and study our consciousness with concepts to produce diagnosis and make conclusions about who we truly are. The whole process is very self-reflective, very circular. You are the object of study and the one conducting the study. But this whole process is also very counterproductive.
I don't know if this is uniquely an American or Western thing, but I think it's this appeal to hyper-individualism that causes a lot of the isolation and ostracism and sense of worthlessness people feel.
Of course, there are limits to that. Some people clearly do not deserve your time and energy, and sometimes putting on a mask for too long can have consequences on your mental health, which is not good. The problem is that in our culture, so a culture heavily based on time management and productivity, we very quickly go from, quote, let me put on a mask to make the other person feel good, to, quote, I don't have the time and the energy for it, I'm sorry. In both our private and work life, emotional labor has an increasingly negative connotation. And for me, that negativity isn't so much about the fact that we have to put on a mask, so being fake. I mean, we put on masks all the time, we romanticize our lives, we add filters. That's not an issue. We know how to be fake and we even enjoy being fake. For me, that negativity associated with emotional labor, you know, the sort of negativity in that meme I showed you earlier, is rather based on the fear of feeling things, especially feeling what others feel. We refuse to feel anger, joy, love, because we have more important things to do and we can't let those emotions get in the way.
I hate to be the one to reveal this, but there was a point in each person's life where they, even you watching this right now, were a crying, babbling little mound of fat, pissing and shitting and vomiting themselves on a regular basis without the sense or muscle mass necessary to even find food for themselves. And it was the society, the people around you, including but not limited to those in your household, if you had one, who fed you, cleaned up your mess, and taught you language and provided you shelter. We actually owe each other everything. Basic human decency isn't about just doing what you can to avoid confrontation or difficulty, to get through life and achieve what you want with as little hassle as possible. It's about returning the favor for the love, for the nurturing, for the safety, for the knowledge, for the joy, for the entertainment, for the meaning, for the comfort we have received since we were born. That's at the core of empathy, I think. And it's important to shed this false idea of I live for me and me alone and embrace the reality that we owe much of our existence and who we are to those who were in our lives, many of whom we will never even know or remember.
But by putting myself in this slight discomfort and talking to strangers, I understood that you need that outward perspective. You need to learn about all those experiences that you yourself cannot be familiar with and that your therapist won't be familiar with either. If someone asked me, what do you owe to people? I would say everything. I mean, that's why I'm left-wing. I recognize that the person I am today is the product of so many interactions and experiences that I couldn't predict. Other people made me, and it is my job to help them become the person they want to be, or at least challenge their preconceptions about themselves.
Now, a few lingering points. One, rejection is a normal, meaningful, and expected part of life, and you should never sacrifice your own well-being and happiness for someone because you pity them. Trust me, young impressionable men who may or may not be listening, pity sex doesn't feel as good as real enthusiastic sex. And I say this as someone who had his first kiss in senior year of college and officially lost his virginity in his mid-20s. Also, critically, pity is not the same as empathy. For example, lots of people pity homeless people, but they don't empathize with them one bit. 2, I understand ghosting as a defense mechanism, particularly for often women or other historically disadvantaged groups who are victims of stalking, harassment, or abuse. The levels of ghosting we see regularly, though, in the internet age, on dating sites and the like, is not gendered, and it is rampant. And I think it adds to people's senses of isolation, disconnection with others, and this push for hyper-individualism. If someone has done you no wrong or harm or discomfort, you can afford them the basic human decency of an explicit rejection.
Initially, I wanted to make a video about ghosting, which for me is a good example of how we sometimes refuse to do the emotional labor, so to fill things in order to protect our peace. Again, there are many cases in which ghosting is totally valid, but you see what I mean. Now, no matter the circumstances, ghosting requires a certain degree of self-estrangement, which is itself, and quite ironically, a form of emotional labor. By that I mean that everybody knows deep down that ghosting is not good. That's why we try to find justifications as to why we do it. It means that we feel guilty in a way. The way I see it is that ghosting requires you to kind of separate your mind and body in order to do the bad thing. The same way a flight attendant has to separate her mind and body when having to remain polite with the worst clients. The problem is that as you seek to protect your peace at all costs, as you seek to build your brand, you have to repeat those processes of self-estrangement again and again. You have to repress the emotions you are supposed to feel in order to move on. Now, how can that be compatible with the goal of figuring out who you are, finding your authentic self? When has it become too much of an effort to let things affect you and shape you? Why do we think that in order to become our true self, we have to isolate from other struggles, questions, and feelings? That does not make sense to me.
3, none of this is to say you should ever bend over backwards to help someone you don't know, or that you even need to entertain people you don't know. It also doesn't mean you should never be angry or mean or tell someone to fuck off if it's warranted. And it very often is. You don't have to talk to or like everyone you see. I personally wish nothing but pain and suffering on Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. But common humanity is a vibe. When you know it, you know it. Right here I had this little section talking about how, having empathy, showing common human decency is a vibe. It's like, holding doors open and saying please and thank you. But that's not really having common human decency. That's just being polite, right? I think empathy is bigger than just being polite. You can be polite and still not have a shred of empathy. Sometimes people are just polite for the sake of being polite, for the sake of avoiding conflict. And that's not really what empathy is. Empathy is really understanding and feeling how someone else is feeling, really trying to understand where they're coming from. And yeah, so fuck what I was going to say. Empathy is what we should strive for, not politeness. Common human decency is not about just going along to get along. It's about like really understanding the humanity of another person and why they feel the way they feel. On the internet, it's easy to lose sense of that because, like, none of us are real. We're all just flat images on a glowing screen. But we're all still here because of each other, you know? We do live in a world full of rape and abuse and assault and domestic violence and murder and the exploitation and predation of minors and all kinds of other antisocial horrors. I think understanding and acknowledging that we're all kind of in this together helps to combat some of the spiritual causes for these things. And I speak as someone who has experienced intimate partner violence and who's only in the last few years coming to terms with the fact that, put simply, I was sexually taken advantage of as a child. So I know some of these evils firsthand. I just really believe empathy, understanding that there are consequences to everything I do beyond myself, is the foundation to minimizing many of these societal ills.
I want to make it clear that it's not because I criticize pop psychology that I don't understand the power of self-knowledge. I do understand that introspection is essential to fully develop yourself, but what I'm trying to show in this video is that introspection cannot work alone because of how interdependent we are. Protecting your peace can be counterproductive because of the self-estrangement it requires. I don't think you will reach any sort of higher self by refusing to let yourself feel what other people feel, whether they are your family, friends, colleagues, or strangers living miles and miles away from you.
It's done. I have him.